A mother, drowning in despair, faced a choice no parent should ever have to make. A wealthy man, offering a fortune, presented her with a deal that seemed impossible to refuse, but years later, she would discover the devastating consequences. When she finally learned the truth, it shattered everything. What was the dark secret that had been buried for so long? Emma had never felt so exhausted in her life. Her body ached, her head throbbed, and yet she couldn't sleep. The sterile white walls of the hospital room felt suffocating, as if they were closing in on her. In the small bassinet beside her bed, her newborn son, Liam, lay peacefully asleep, completely unaware of the harsh world awaiting them outside these walls. She had nothing. No job. No family to help her. No idea how she was going to feed her child once they left the hospital. The only reason she had given birth here, in a prestigious private hospital, was because of a last-minute charity grant. A stroke of luck, or perhaps fate. But that luck would run out the moment she stepped outside. She turned her head toward the doorway as she heard muffled sobs from the room next to hers. A deep, painful weeping. It was the sound of a mother who had lost everything. Emma felt a lump in her throat. She could only imagine that kind of pain. The nurses moved quietly through the hallways, their hushed voices blending with the distant beeping of medical equipment. But then, something strange. A conversation, spoken in hushed tones, caught Emma's attention. "Did you hear about the Blackwoods?" one nurse whispered. "It's terrible." "But why is he still here?" another responded. "He's refusing to leave. He's demanding they fix it." "Fix it? How?" The voices trailed off, but the unease lingered. Emma didn't know who the Blackwoods were, and she had no energy to care. All she could think about was Liam, his tiny fingers wrapped around hers. Her son. The only thing in the world that mattered. Then, a shadow appeared in her doorway. A man, tall, imposing, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit. His presence filled the room with an unshakable sense of power. He didn't belong in a hospital, at least, not this part of it. Emma's pulse quickened. She recognized him. Victor Blackwood. A billionaire. A name she had heard on the news. But why was he here? Why was he looking at her? His voice was deep, measured, yet strangely gentle. "Miss Carter," he said, stepping closer. "I understand you've just had a child." Emma instinctively pulled Liam's bassinet closer, her heart pounding. "Who are you? What do you want?" Victor sighed, glancing briefly at the sleeping infant before meeting her eyes again. "My wife. Had a child tonight as well." He paused. "He didn't survive." Emma swallowed hard, feeling an ache in her chest. She barely knew this man, yet she could feel the weight of his grief. "I have a proposition for you," he continued. "One that will change both of our lives forever." The room suddenly felt colder. Emma clutched the edges of her blanket, her body stiff. "What? What do you mean?" Victor stepped forward, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I want your child." Silence. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The world around her seemed to stop. Victor reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek black briefcase. He placed it on the hospital tray in front of her and, with a soft click, opened it. Inside, neatly stacked bundles of cash filled every inch of space. More money than Emma had ever seen in her life. $500,000, he said calmly. "You walk away. You start over. No one will ever know." Emma felt like the walls were closing in on her. Her mind screamed at her to say no, to throw him out. But then, an even more terrifying thought crept in. What kind of life could she give Liam? No food. No future. A life of suffering. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked down at her son, sleeping so peacefully, unaware that his fate was being decided in that very moment. Victor closed the briefcase softly. "Think about it," he murmured. "You have until sunrise." Then, without another word, he turned and left the room. Emma sat there, frozen. The sound of the door clicking shut behind him felt deafening. She looked at the money. Then at her son. Then back at the money. The choice was hers. and it would haunt her for the rest of her life. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the briefcase sat in front of her, its glossy black surface gleaming under the sterile hospital lights. The money inside was overwhelming, stacks upon stacks of crisp bills, each bundle bound tightly, an undeniable fortune staring back at her. She had never seen so much money in her life. She could barely breathe. Victor Blackwood stood tall beside her bed, his expression calm, unreadable. He wasn't pressuring her, at least, not directly. He simply waited, giving her time to absorb the weight of his word. $500,000, he repeated smoothly. Take it. Walk away. Give your child the future he deserves. Emma's hands trembled as she reached out, not to take the money, but to close the briefcase. She shut it with a decisive click, her pulse racing. This is insane, she whispered, barely able to form the words. You want me to just give up my baby? Victor exhaled slowly, as if he had expected this reaction. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. Miss Carter, I am offering you an opportunity. You're alone. You have no financial stability, no support system. But with this money you can build a life. Not just for yourself, but for your child. Emma flinched. For my child, she repeated, her voice breaking. You're asking me to give him up, and you're telling me it's for him? Victor's expression didn't change. What future do you see for him, realistically? He gestured toward the peeling paint on the hospital walls, the frayed edges of her thin hospital gown. Struggle? Hunger? A childhood filled with uncertainty. Emma gritted her teeth, tears brimming in her eyes. You don't know anything about me. Victor sighed, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine suit. You're right. I don't. But I do know what it's like to grow up with nothing. To claw your way up from the bottom. It's a cruel world, Miss Carter. And sometimes, the hardest choices lead to the best outcomes. Emma shook her head. This isn't a hard choice. It's an impossible one. Victor studied her for a moment before stepping back, his face still unreadable. I won't force you, he said finally. I'm not a monster. Emma let out a hollow laugh. Could have fooled me. He ignored the jab. I'm giving you time to think. But understand this, my wife. She won't survive another loss. She believes her child is still alive. And in her mind, he is. Emma swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. Why me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why my baby? Victor's gaze was unwavering. Because fate brought us here. You were admitted last minute under a charity program. No records, no connections, no family to ask questions. A clean slate. Emma felt sick. She had spent her life believing in miracles. Now she wondered if she had just walked into the cruelest one of all. Victor walked to the door, pausing before looking back. You have until sunrise. Emma's breath hitched. And if I say no? Victor's eyes darkened slightly. Then you walk away with nothing. And your child faces the life you were trying so desperately to avoid. A long silence hung between them before Victor finally left the room. Emma sat there, staring at the briefcase. The air felt heavy, suffocating. She turned to Liam, his tiny fingers curled into fists, his soft breath steady and peaceful. What kind of mother was she if she even considered this? But what kind of mother would she be if she didn't? The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly toward dawn. The choice was hers. And no matter what she decided, it would haunt her forever. The room was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Each second felt like an unbearable weight pressing down on Emma's chest. She sat on the edge of her hospital bed, her hands gripping the thin bedsheet as if it could anchor her to reality. But reality had shifted, warped into something unrecognizable. The briefcase sat there, motionless yet screaming at her. The money inside could change everything. $500,000. Enough to start over, to secure a future for her child. But it came at an unthinkable cost. She turned her gaze to Liam, sleeping peacefully in his bassinet. His tiny fingers twitched in his sleep, his chest rising and falling in the soft rhythm of newborn dreams. He was perfect. He was hers. And yet, she was considering giving him away. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, guilt crashing over her like a tidal wave. What kind of mother even thinks about this? What kind of mother hesitates when it comes to her child? But the cruel truth was, she wasn't hesitating because she didn't love him. She was hesitating because she did. Her mind spun with questions. Would he hate her if he ever found out? Would he grow up happier, healthier, safer in a mansion rather than in a rundown apartment with a struggling single mother? She ran her hands through her hair, fighting back tears. There was no right choice. Only a choice she would have to live with. The minutes stretched unbearably long. Her heart pounded in her ears as she stood up, walked over to the bassinet, and carefully picked Liam up. He stirred slightly but didn't wake, his tiny body warm against her chest. "I love you," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Her legs trembled as she turned toward the door. The hallway was dark, the only illumination coming from the dim emergency lights that lined the walls. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. She reached the nursery. The rows of bassinets glowed softly under the fluorescent light. The tiny babies, swaddled in hospital blankets, were all sleeping soundly. A nurse sat at a nearby desk, flipping through a chart, not paying her any attention. Emma's pulse roared in her ears. This was her moment. One step forward, and everything would change forever. Her hands trembled as she gently placed Liam into an empty bassinet near the far end of the room. She stood there for a moment, staring at him, willing herself to remember every detail, his soft cheeks, his tiny fists, the way his eyelashes curled ever so slightly. Then, with her heart hammering, she turned to the other bassinet, the one labeled Baby Blackwood. She reached out and lifted the still infant into her arms. He was so light, so fragile. A wave of nausea rolled through her. What was she doing? Her breathing turned ragged. The weight of what she was about to do crushed her chest. She took a step back. Then another. Her mind screamed at her to stop. But then, a terrifying thought whispered through her consciousness. If you don't do this, what future will Liam have? Tears blurred her vision. With one final deep breath, she placed Baby Blackwood into Liam's bassinet. A part of her wanted to run, to snatch her son back and never let go. But she knew. She knew she wouldn't. She couldn't. Emma turned on her heel and walked out of the nursery, her hands clenched into fists, her breath shaky. The briefcase was waiting for her back in her room. And so was the price of her decision. Emma had always believed that time would dull the pain, that the years would soften the unbearable weight pressing on her chest. She was wrong. It had been nearly a decade since that night in the hospital, the night she walked away with a suitcase full of money and left her son in the arms of another family. And yet, the memory was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. She had moved far away, changed everything about her life. A new home, a new name, a new existence. The money had given her comfort, security, things she never thought she would have. She built a small business, kept to herself, and raised Liam in a safe, stable home. But no amount of wealth could erase the shame that haunted her. Every year, on Liam's birthday, Emma would find herself awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he somehow remembered. If, on some deep, primal level, he knew that his life had once belonged to someone else. She kept an old newspaper clipping hidden in a drawer, away from curious eyes. It was a feature piece on the Blackwood family, celebrating the birth of their only heir, Nathan Blackwood. In the picture, Victor stood tall, his arm wrapped around his wife, who beamed as she held the child, Emma's child. Her hands trembled as she traced the image with her fingertip. He looked happy, well-fed, adored. And yet, something was off. Over the years, she had followed their lives from a distance. Nathan had been in and out of hospitals for unexplained medical issues. News outlets reported strange inconsistencies in his records, but the Blackwoods had always brushed off concerns. Emma told herself it didn't mean anything. that it wasn't her place to question. But deep down, a gnawing fear had taken root in her chest. Had she made a mistake? Liam was growing into a sharp, curious boy. At 10 years old, he had his father's eyes, an eerie reminder of the past Emma had tried so hard to bury. He was bright, always asking questions, always wanting to know more. And lately, he had started asking about his father. Where did he go? Liam asked one evening, sitting at the dinner table. His tone was casual, but his eyes were piercing. Why don't we have any pictures of him? Emma's breath caught in her throat. She forced a smile. He wasn't around much. We don't talk about him. Liam frowned. That doesn't make sense. Emma swallowed hard. He was getting older. Smarter. He wouldn't accept half-truths for much longer. One afternoon, as she was folding laundry, she heard rustling from the other room. Liam had found the drawer. The one where she kept the newspaper clippings. She rushed in, her heart pounding. He was holding the article about the Blackwoods, his small fingers tracing over the photograph. Who are they? He asked. Emma's stomach twisted into knots. She snatched the paper away. It's nothing, she said quickly, shoving it back into the drawer. Liam studied her for a long moment, his brows furrowing. You're lying, he said quietly. Emma opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in 10 years, she felt the walls closing in. Meanwhile, miles away, in a mansion built on wealth and secrets, Victor Blackwood was losing control. Nathan had started asking questions too. About his blood type, his medical history, why things didn't add up. Victor had always been careful. He had sealed the hospital records, erased any trace of what happened that night. But cracks were beginning to form. Nathan was getting older, and one day he would demand the truth. Emma and Victor had spent a decade convincing themselves that the past would stay buried. But they were about to learn that secrets never stay hidden forever. Nathan Blackwood had always felt like something was wrong. It wasn't a feeling he could easily describe, just a lingering sense that he didn't quite fit into the world he had been born into. It started when he was young. Doctors were puzzled by his medical records. His blood type didn't match either of his parents. There were small inconsistencies, things that could be explained away at first. But as he grew older, the explanations felt thinner. The looks exchanged between his parents when he asked questions. The discomfort in their voices. It was as if there was a truth lurking just beneath the surface, one no one wanted to acknowledge. And then, on his 15th birthday, he found something that shattered everything. A locked drawer in his father's study had been left slightly open, just enough for Nathan to notice. Curiosity got the best of him. Inside, he found a folder marked confidential. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. His birth certificate, his hospital records, and at the bottom, a crumpled letter from a retired nurse. There was a mistake the night of your son's birth. I don't know what happened, but I remember the Blackwood baby was gone. And then suddenly there was a new one. Please. You need to look into this before it's too late. Nathan's world spun. That night, he confronted his father. Why do my medical records say I don't match you or Mom? Nathan's voice was sharp, demanding. Why did you hide this? Victor Blackwood's jaw clenched. For the first time in Nathan's life, he saw fear in his father's eyes. You need to forget this, Victor said, his voice dangerously low. Stop asking questions. But Nathan couldn't stop. Meanwhile, across the city, Liam was also searching for answers. Emma had been acting strange. Ever since he found that newspaper clipping about the Blackwoods, she had been nervous, distant. She kept brushing off his questions, but Liam knew she was hiding something. So he decided to investigate on his own. At the local library, he scrolled through old articles, piecing together the puzzle. Nathan Blackwood, heir to the Blackwood fortune, was born the same night as me. The hospital records from that night were mysteriously sealed. A nurse had spoken out once, but then vanished from the public eye. Liam's blood ran cold. The pieces fit together in a way he didn't want to believe. Had he been switched at birth? Was his entire life a lie? Determined, Liam found the name of the retired nurse who had sent the letter to Victor Blackwood. If anyone knew the truth, it was her. But when he arrived at her last known address, she was gone. Her house was abandoned. And in her mailbox, he found a single, ominous note. Stop digging. This secret was buried for a reason. Liam felt his stomach drop. Someone didn't want the truth to come out. But now it was too late to turn back. Nathan Blackwood sat alone in his room, staring at the documents spread across his desk. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. Everything he had ever believed about himself, his family, his entire life, it was all unraveling before him. His birth certificate, the nurse's letter, the sealed hospital records. It was undeniable now. He wasn't a Blackwood. He had never been. A rage he had never felt before boiled in his veins. His father had lied to him. His mother, was she even his mother? Had she known? Or had she been deceived, just like him? Nathan clenched his fist. He needed answers. And he needed them now. Downstairs, Victor Blackwood was in his study, sipping a glass of whiskey, unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. Nathan stormed in, slamming the documents onto the desk. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice shaking with fury. Victor glanced down at the papers. A flicker of something crossed his face, annoyance? Fear? But it was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual cold indifference. "You shouldn't have found that," he said simply, taking another sip of his drink. Nathan's chest tightened. "That's all you have to say?" His voice rose. "You stole me from another family. You lied to me my whole life." Victor finally set his glass down and met his son's eyes. "You are a Blackwood," he said evenly. "You were raised as one. You have every privilege, every advantage. That is all that matters." Nathan took a step back, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's all that matters?" His voice cracked. "You think this is just about money? About power? What about the people you destroyed?" Victor's expression hardened. "Your real mother," he spat, "sold you for a briefcase full of cash." Silence. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. Victor leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "That woman didn't love you enough to keep you. She made a choice, and she never looked back. I gave you everything she never could." Nathan felt like he had been punched in the stomach. He wanted to deny it, to call his father a liar, but the truth was right there, staring at him. His world spun. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Liam had made a decision of his own. The note in the abandoned nurse's mailbox had been a warning, a threat. But it had only fueled his determination. He needed proof. And there was only one way to get it. That night, Liam walked into a DNA testing center. He handed over 2 samples, one from himself, and one he had secretly taken from his mother. The results came back 2 days later. And they confirmed everything. Emma Carter was not his biological mother. The truth slammed into him like a freight train. He wasn't just adopted. He had been stolen. Fury. Confusion. Betrayal. Emma had raised him, loved him, cared for him. But how could she have lied to him for so long? He had to confront her. He had to know the truth. That evening, Liam burst through the door of their small home, his hands shaking as he held up the DNA result. "Tell me this is a mistake," he begged, his voice raw with emotion. "Tell me I'm really your son." Emma froze. The color drained from her face as she read the results. Her hands trembled, her lips parted, but no words came out. She couldn't lie anymore. Tears welled in her eyes. "Liam." But Liam was already backing away. "You sold me," he whispered, his voice broken. Emma sobbed. "I thought I was giving you a better life." Liam's world shattered. The woman he had trusted more than anyone had betrayed him in the worst way imaginable. He turned and ran. And Emma knew. She might never get him back. Liam ran. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his vision blurred by tears. The DNA test results crumpled in his fist, proof that everything he had known was a lie. His mother, Emma, the woman who had raised him, loved him, sacrificed for him, had also sold him. The pain was unbearable. He needed answers. He needed the truth. And he knew exactly where to find it. Meanwhile, Nathan Blackwood stood in the grand foyer of his family's estate, his mind spinning after confronting his father. The man he had idolized, feared, obeyed, had stolen him as an infant. And what was worse, he had no remorse. Nathan clenched his fists, his stomach churning with a mix of rage and grief. Then the front door burst open. Liam. They locked eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Liam held up the crumpled paper in his hand, his voice raw. "Tell me it's a lie." Nathan swallowed hard. "I wish I could." Liam's hands shook as he read aloud. "Emma Carter is not the biological mother of Liam Carter. A 99.9% match has been found between," his voice cracked, "Victor and Margaret Blackwood." Silence filled the air, heavy and suffocating. Victor entered the room, his face eerily calm. "I see you've met," he said, pouring himself a drink. Liam turned to him, his blood boiling. "You did this," he hissed. "You paid my mother to give me up. You took me like I was nothing." Victor took a slow sip of his whiskey. "I saved you," he corrected coldly. "You grew up in comfort. You had a life she never could have given you." Liam's body trembled. "You had no right." Victor scoffed, setting his glass down. "Your mother made the deal. She took the money. She walked away. If you want to blame someone, blame her." Liam flinched. Nathan's jaw clenched. He stepped forward, his voice low, shaking with rage. "You are a monster." Victor sighed, rolling his eyes. "Enough theatrics. What do you both expect to happen now? That we all sit down and cry together?" Liam's hands balled into fists. "I want my life back." Victor let out a humorless chuckle. "Your life? And what life is that, exactly? You're not a Blackwood. You're not even a Carter. You're nothing." The words cut deeper than a knife. Nathan snapped. He lunged at Victor, grabbing him by the collar. "You ruined everything," he roared. "You stole me from my real family, you lied to me, you used all of us like we were nothing more than pieces in your sick little game." Victor didn't struggle. He simply smirked. "And yet, I still won." Nathan's knuckles turned white. He wanted to hit him, to make him feel even an ounce of the pain he had caused. But he didn't. Instead, he let go. "You're done," Nathan said, stepping back. "I want nothing to do with you." Victor's smirk faltered, just for a second. Liam exhaled shakily, turning back to Nathan. "So what now?" Nathan looked at him, the brother he never knew he had. "And he made a choice. We find our real mother." Victor's voice cut through the air like a knife. "She's not your mother. She's the woman who sold you for a briefcase full of cash." Nathan turned back, his expression unreadable. "And you're the man who bought him. That doesn't make you his father." Victor said nothing. For the first time in his life, he had lost control. Nathan and Liam walked out of the mansion together, leaving Victor behind. And neither of them looked back. The world didn't stop. Not for the truth. Not for the pain. Days passed since Liam and Nathan had walked away from the Blackwood mansion, leaving behind the man who had orchestrated their stolen lives. But the storm that followed was impossible to escape. The media erupted. Billionaire Victor Blackwood exposed in shocking stolen baby scandal. A mother's betrayal. Woman sold her child for fortune, now the truth is out. Nathan Blackwood isn't a Blackwood at all, DNA results prove shocking swap. The story was everywhere. Reporters camped outside Victor's estate, his name dragged through every headline, every news outlet. The business empire he had spent decades building began to crumble. Stockholders withdrew. Investors backed away. Lawsuits emerged. Victor tried to fight it. He denied. He paid people off. But the evidence was too overwhelming. And for the first time in his life, he was powerless. Nathan watched from a distance. He felt nothing for the man who had raised him, only an overwhelming sense of relief that he would never be under his control again. But there was something else, something unfinished. Emma. She had spent days locked in her house, barely eating, barely speaking. The moment Liam found out the truth, he had left without a word. The silence was unbearable. She had raised him, loved him, but would he ever forgive her? Then one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, there was a knock at the door. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She opened it. Liam stood there. His face was unreadable, his expression guarded. Behind him, Nathan. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, Liam finally broke the silence. Why? Emma's eyes filled with tears. She had waited for this moment, dreaded it, but she had no easy answers. She stepped aside, letting them in. They sat in the dimly lit living room, the air thick with emotions too heavy to put into words. Emma took a shaky breath. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. "I never stopped regretting it." Liam swallowed hard. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times. He had wanted to scream at her, to demand how she could have done something so unforgivable. But now, sitting here, looking at the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, he felt only exhaustion. Nathan, who had spent his life believing in a lie, finally spoke. "You thought you were giving him a better life." Emma nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I took something from both of you. And I can never fix that." Silence. Then Liam exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he admitted. Emma nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't deserve it." Another silence. This time softer. Nathan looked at Liam. "We can't change what happened," he said. "But we decide what happens next." Emma wiped her face, nodding. "You're right." A long pause. Then, cautiously, Liam asked, "Where do we even start?" Nathan gave a small, almost hesitant smile. "Maybe with breakfast." Emma let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "I think I can manage that." It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a happy ending. But it was a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, they were finally facing the future together.